Greetings, this is Greg. I get a lot of comments about British test pilot Eric Brown and his statements on the dive speed limitations of U.S. fighters, specifically the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the P-51 Mustang. As this comes up over and over, I think it's time to take a good look at it. According to Eric Brown, U.S. Army Air Force General Jimmy Doolittle came to the British for help with determining Mach limits for U.S. fighters. Simply put, the Mach limit is the speed limitation expressed as a percentage of the speed of sound. Mach 1 is the speed of sound, a Mach number of 0.8 is 8/10ths the speed of sound, and so on. Now, the speed of sound varies with temperature, which means in the standard atmosphere it's lower at higher altitudes. And a World War II fighter in a dive could reach these limits and encounter the effects of compressibility, from which recovery could be difficult or impossible. In regards to the Mach limits of U.S. fighters, Eric Brown says in his book, quote, "The Americans needed urgent help," unquote. His story is that Jimmy Doolittle received reports from B-17 tail gunners that U.S. fighters would dive on the German fighters and then just disappear. Brown implies very strongly that they disappeared because they hit compressibility, meaning the Mach limit of the airplane, and then crashed, in his words, leaving big holes in the ground in Germany. The British then tested U.S. fighters for Mach limits and then determined that the P-38 and P-47 were, according to Eric Brown, quote, "useless," unquote. He then goes on to say that the P-51 was the only U.S. airplane with a high enough Mach limit to combat the German fighters, and then very strongly implies that it's because of this information provided by the British to Doolittle that the U.S. Army Air Force in Europe switched over to the P-51s and then ultimately won the war. Here is the problem. I can't find a shred of evidence corroborating this version of the story. The only source for this is Eric Brown himself. You would think that if it was true that Jimmy Doolittle would have mentioned this in his autobiography. I mean, that would be a pretty big deal. The P-47's Mach limit was so low that it was useless, and for that reason they switched over to the P-51s. That would be at least worthy of a mention. However, there is no mention of any of this in his book or in any other writings I could find from Doolittle or anyone else. Republic updated the P-47 pilot manuals quite a few times during the war. Some of these updates were well after these British tests, yet there is no mention of a change in procedure or dive speed limitations. So if Doolittle, who was in charge of the 8th Air Force, knew about this information and took it seriously, why wasn't it put into later manuals, or at least sent out as some sort of bulletin to pilots? The P-47 was flown at high altitude over Europe by the 56th Fighter Group until the Germans surrender, and then by others in the Pacific until the end of the war there, and then into the post-war years. Yet we don't see any hint of Eric Brown's .71 tactical Mach limit in any documentation for the pilots that flew the plane. Furthermore, I want to add that I can't find a single picture of a British P-47 with Mach measuring equipment on it, not one. It turns out that's because, by Eric Brown's own admission, the British didn't put such equipment on the U.S. planes for testing, which has to at least call into question his results. On the other hand, I can find many such pictures of Thunderbolts when being tested by NACA, but again, none by the British. I'm not implying that the British didn't do these tests, they did, but I question just how scientific they were, as by Eric Brown's own admission, they were not using any actual Mach measuring equipment. Let's just back up for a moment to the beginning of the story to see if it even passes the reasonableness test. The story goes something like this. Some B-17 tail gunners saw P-47s dive after some German planes and then disappear. Fine. I don't doubt for a second that Doolittle received reports that said just that. But concluding it's because they hit compressibility and struck the ground is quite a stretch. It's hard to keep an aircraft diving at 400 miles per hour in sight, especially when watching for enemy fighters. It doesn't take long at all for the P-47 to seemingly disappear. If it's moving opposite the bomber's direction, it's going to be a mile away in only 5 seconds. From the point of view of the tail gunner, sure, the P-47s dove into the fight, disappeared, and were not seen again. But it's likely because they were simply out of sight, either due to range, clouds, or just out of the gunner's field of view. Of course, the gunners would feel frustration at this. Bomber crews often complain that the fighters left them, but it was the nature of air combat. If P-47s were going into compressibility and crashing into the ground in large numbers, we would see strong evidence of that from the surviving squadron mates' reports. Some would have seen that happen to their friends. Of course, some fighters were lost this way, fighters of all types, but in Eric Brown's version of the story, this was some huge epidemic among U.S. fighter planes, and it just doesn't seem to hold up to scrutiny. Now, did Jimmy Doolittle really need urgent help from the British, as Brown claims? I really don't think so. Jimmy Doolittle was one of the most famous pilots in the world at the time, not only for the Doolittle raid in Tokyo, but as a record-setting air race pilot and more. Other than Charles Lindbergh and Eddie Rickenbacker, Doolittle may have been the most famous American pilot at the start of the war. Doolittle wasn't a daredevil either. He was a calculating and intelligent person with deep connections in the aviation and scientific communities. At this point in our story, he is the general of the 8th Air Force. He can talk to the King of England if he wants, which he did. He can get the President of the United States on the phone if he has to. Talking to Republic aircraft, NACA, or just his own pilots in the 8th who were flying the airplanes was not a problem for him. But in Eric Brown's version of the story, Doolittle went hat in hand to the British, urgently needing their help to test the dive performance of American fighters. That just sounds like nonsense, and again, it's not backed up by any source other than Eric Brown. Next, with the results of these British tests, which for some reason Doolittle didn't share with his own pilots or seemingly anyone else, he switched the 8th Air Force over to P-51s. That doesn't sound realistic. And even if it does, the dates don't line up well for this story because P-51s were showing up ready for escort work with long-range tanks before Doolittle took over the 8th and well before Eric Brown did this testing. So the timing for Eric Brown's story doesn't line up with reality. It just doesn't. Every source I tracked down for Eric Brown's story here, including every book, Wikipedia, and I even checked Google AI, all lead back to one of two places: Eric Brown's book or an interview with him. When evaluating Eric Brown's claims, I have to weigh them against the other evidence we have. So let's do that. In fact, I'll start with another British source. This statement from the Royal Air Force's Air Fighting Development Unit shows the Thunderbolt reaching 450 miles per hour indicated at 20,000 feet. That works out to just over Mach 0.83. Of course, that's by taking the indicated airspeed and directly converting it to a Mach number in the standard atmosphere, but that is what Eric Brown was doing. By his own admission, remember, he didn't have the proper Mach speed testing equipment. It's worth noting that in the same British test, they found that the Thunderbolt could easily outdive the Spitfire. They're not talking specifically about Mach limitations there, but rather dive performance in general. Now, nobody called the Spitfire useless because of poor dive performance. Over in the United States, NACA at the Ames Research Center did have the proper testing equipment on these planes, as shown in this picture, and they did specifically test Mach limits. They ran the plane up to 0.82. That was, of course, with a real P-47 in flight. Fun fact, NACA also built very accurate scale models of the P-47 and other planes for testing all sorts of variables in a timely manner. Things like testing for Mach limits with different power settings, or with wing-mounted drop tanks or other variables. In this picture, they were dive testing recovery flaps. Using models like this one also enabled them to perform tests that would have been incredibly dangerous or fatal in a real airplane. As an example, they would test the model at such high speeds that they would get supersonic airflow over the model in some areas. In the case of the P-47, as high as Mach 1.4. You could never do that if testing in a real World War II fighter. The testing of the models gave a maximum Mach number of 0.83, very close to NACA's testing of the actual plane at the Ames Research Facility of 0.82. At Langley, NACA tested the Thunderbolt's maneuverability, again, specifically maneuverability, not the ultimate Mach limit, at 0.76. The highest Mach limit in the pilot manual works out to about 0.775, based on indicated airspeeds alone. Corrected for calibrated airspeed, it works out to about 0.79, which certainly fits in with what we see from NACA when one considers that the pilot's manual will be slightly conservative here. I want to take a moment to say that if this is the type of stuff you like, please consider joining my Patreon. There you can find NACA reports, pilot manuals, and much more. Just about all the documents I use in creating these videos are there. I put up some exclusive content there as well, including polls to decide the direction of the channel, previews of upcoming topics, and of course you'll have a direct line of communication with me. Memberships there start at only $1, which I think is a pretty good deal. Back to our story. We were talking about the NACA results, but what did P-47 pilots say about the plane's dive performance in the real world? Well, actually, quite a lot. Robert S. Johnson, a leading P-47 ace and later chief test pilot for Republic, stated in an interview that, quote, absolutely nothing could stay with it in a dive, unquote. Of course, context matters here. He doesn't mean literally nothing, but rather that against the planes encountered at the time, that nothing could outdive the Thunderbolt. In his book, he repeatedly references situations in which the Thunderbolt outperformed German fighters in a dive. As a side note, he references the FW-290 here. When I first read this many years ago, I thought it was a typo. It's not. His actual combat report for this encounter says the exact same thing. In fact, most of the descriptions of encounters in his book are essentially copies of the original encounter reports during the war. Now, there are other references to the FW-290 in other U.S. documents. It appears this was a very short-lived U.S. designation for the newer, longer-nosed FW-190 Antons, meaning the A5s and later, not to be confused with the really long-nosed 190s like the Doras. Here's another page from his book and another reference to being able to outdive German fighters. This is pretty typical of combat reports from P-47 pilots. Francis Gabreski, another top P-47 ace, said about the same thing. He described the P-47's dive performance as spectacular and stated that the tactic of trying to dive away from a P-47 did not work for German fighters. There are a mountain of combat reports from P-47 pilots, and the general theme is that the German prop fighters did not escape the P-47s by diving. In this combat report, officially called an encounter report, a pilot reports reaching 550 miles per hour in a dive at 6,000 feet. That's in January of 1944, when it's so cold this had to be at least Mach 0.80, probably 0.82 or 0.83. Here is a report in which a 109 attempted to evade via a high-speed dive. It didn't work, and the Thunderbolt pilot even pointed out that attempting to escape a Thunderbolt via a high-speed dive was a sign of inexperience on the part of the 109 pilot. In this report, we see both a 109 and a Thunderbolt hitting compressibility. The 109 was not able to pull out, the Thunderbolt was. There are many such encounter reports showing P-47s using their dive performance to prevail in a fight. I've been through a lot of these reports, and I can't find a single one, not one, in which a P-47 is outperformed in a dive by a 109 or a 190. Now you might say, well, survivor bias. No, not really, because although in every case the Thunderbolt seems to prevail, those are the cases we tend to have, when it comes to a high-speed dive, there are a lot of cases in which the German pilots don't simply dive away. Now, if Eric Brown's assessment that the German planes could easily escape by diving was correct, then why didn't they? I can't find a single example of that happening versus a Thunderbolt. More often than not, it's something like the situation we see in this report. Here, the German pilot started at 19,000 feet with a 1,000-foot altitude advantage and already in a dive. He then transitioned into a turn fight. It seems likely that this 190 pilot knew not to try and outdive the Thunderbolt. It's not at all typical in these combat reports for the German pilots to try and dive away, and in the cases where it happens, the Thunderbolt seems to prevail. In this report, we have a Thunderbolt chasing a 190 in a diving turn while being pursued by another 190. The Thunderbolt got the kill on the first 190, and the second 190 was unable to close with the Thunderbolt. This one is interesting for several reasons. It shows a Thunderbolt not only in a high-speed dive against enemy fighters, but also maneuvering. It's also interesting that in this encounter, the Thunderbolt pilot was able to escape the second 190 in a climb. That's probably due to the speed built up in the dive, but also the date on this report is just after the Thunderbolts started getting their paddle props, which greatly improved climb performance. We can also look at this from the German point of view. In Gunter Rahl's authorized biography, it says he knew that the P-47 was faster in a dive than the 109. Rahl had actually flown a captured P-47 and was familiar with the plane. He fought against them a lot. He was actually shot down by one. In this book by German ace Heinz NACA, we have some good information. He flew on the Western Front well into 1944 and had 33 confirmed kills. Many of those were against U.S. aircraft. He was also shot down by U.S. aircraft quite a few times. He may have been the only pilot to have been shot down by a P-38, a P-47, a P-51, a B-17, and a B-24. He was shot down by P-47 Thunderbolts at least 3 times, maybe 5, depending on how you count forced landings. In one of those engagements, he managed to shoot down the Thunderbolt that had just shot him down. In other words, with his stricken airplane, he was able to get some final rounds off. Ultimately, his combat flying came to an end, ironically, by hitting a landmine in a car. He details a number of encounters with the Thunderbolt. In one, when he needed to escape, he used a spiral climb in his 109. It's worth looking at the date here. This is before Thunderbolts were equipped with paddle props and water injection, which is why this worked so well for him. At no point in this book does he escape Thunderbolts via a high-speed dive. In fact, we see the opposite. There is nothing I can find that indicates that German pilots would routinely escape P-47s by diving. All the evidence I can find points to the opposite. Of course, that's not to say it never happened. There was a time when the Thunderbolts were told not to follow the enemy fighters and to generally stay with the bombers, so in those cases, sure, the German fighters could escape by diving. And there were certainly cases of German fighters escaping by diving into the clouds, but those sort of things are not due to limitations on the part of the P-47. I just can't find anything that even remotely backs up Eric Brown's story. The sources I put up show that the Thunderbolt could reach at least Mach 0.76 and maneuver at that speed with an absolute upper limit of around Mach 0.82. I don't think these Mach numbers can be disputed because all the sources I used are the highest possible level and largely in agreement with each other. This is backed up in terms of comparative performance with German aircraft by the people who flew Thunderbolts in combat, and quite a few of them. So let's summarize this. In one hand, I have Republic aircraft, the Royal Air Force's Air Fighting Development Unit, NACA at both Langley, Virginia, and at the Ames Research Center in California, as well as Robert S. Johnson, Francis Gabreski, and a lot of other P-47 Thunderbolt pilots, all saying pretty much the same thing in regards to dive speeds and Mach limitations. And it's all backed up by reports from German pilots. In the other hand, I have people constantly telling me in the comments section that the Thunderbolt's Mach limit is only 0.71 because Eric Brown said so. However, that's not exactly what Eric Brown said, so let's take a look at that. He said that the Thunderbolt's tactical Mach limit is 0.71. You see, tactical Mach limit is something that Eric Brown and or the people he was working with made up. It's not the same thing as the Mach limit or the critical Mach number. As far as I know, it's never been referenced before or since in regards to testing of World War II fighters. The tactical Mach limit, as described by Eric Brown, required some entirely arbitrary and subjective degree of maneuverability at that limit. Eric Brown tested for the tactical Mach limit, which again he said is 0.71. The testing from NACA had the plane maneuvering at 0.76, again with a critical Mach limit of around 0.82. Still, why the big disparity between what Eric Brown said and what seems to be reality? I think I have a good explanation. Now hear me out on this. I think that the standards Eric Brown was using for an acceptable amount of required control force were lower than what everybody else was using. That's the only explanation that seems to match up with all the facts we have from the various other sources, without simply resorting to saying Eric Brown was just full of crap, which I don't think he was. I think he was just physically weak. The U.S. fighter pilots went through very strenuous physical conditioning. This is well documented in various autobiographies of Thunderbolt pilots. Eric Brown was a relatively little guy. I don't think he had a lot of physical strength. In fact, he says something to that effect in one of his interviews here on YouTube. This is not a criticism or an attack on him in any way. In fact, for a test pilot, it may have some advantages. Hannah Reicht, who was a German test pilot during the war, mentioned that in at least one case, she thought her relative lack of strength was an asset as a test pilot. By the way, Eric Brown and Hannah Reicht knew each other. That lack of strength in no way held back Hannah Reicht. She even flew the Me-323 along with about every other World War II German plane, and had many great accolades as a pilot, various firsts and records. And I don't mean firsts and records as a female pilot, I mean as a pilot. I guess my point here is that I think the control force requirements for Eric Brown's tactical Mach limit were simply lower than what a typical P-47 pilot could deal with. The overwhelming amount of evidence is that by normal standards and in combat, the Thunderbolt could outdive any German prop fighter. Now, some may dispute that. I know there are some out there who are married to Eric Brown's 0.71 number, and that's fine. But understand that if you're doing that, you are in a sense saying that everyone else was wrong. I just don't think that's a reasonable position considering the sources involved. It's much more reasonable to say that the one person here who is an outlier was wrong. That said, I think my control force explanation makes the most sense. It's also backed up by some evidence. Eric Brown states in an interview, when he talks about tactical Mach limits, that he could generate a maximum of 60 to 65 pounds of force on the control stick. That is not a lot. The standard for testing roll rates in U.S. fighters was to use 50 pounds of lateral force on the stick. That was the standard. In some testing, they were using 80 pounds of force, and again, this is lateral force on the stick. In fact, in at least one U.S. fighter, the P-38 Lightning, the standard was 80 pounds of stick force for the maximum roll rate. That's a little different, though, because the P-38 uses a yoke and not a stick, but still 80 pounds. A pilot can put quite a bit more force on the stick in the fore and aft direction to control the elevator. In one P-47 manual, it says the dive recovery should be initiated by holding a continuous 50 pounds of force, and although there is no control force maximum listed in the manual, we know a maximum had to be much higher than what you might hold continually. It was not unusual in dive testing of U.S. aircraft to see 80 and even 100-pound maximum force on the stick when near compressibility, which is well beyond what Eric Brown himself says was his maximum limit. I think when all this is considered, it's quite obvious that the reason Eric Brown's opinion on the P-47's dive performance is so far off from literally everyone else who tested the plane or flew it in combat is because of two things. First, he was using an arbitrary testing standard nobody else was using, and because compared to a frontline U.S. Army Air Force P-47 pilot, he was a bit of a weakling. As for the rest of his story, it's not credible. The timeline doesn't add up, as the 8th Air Force was already switching to P-51s before Eric Brown's testing, and even before Doolittle took over the 8th. That doesn't mean Eric Brown was lying. I think from his point of view, what he said seemed to be true. I suspect somebody did tell him that Jimmy Doolittle asked for help and that it was urgent. It's impossible to know exactly how that went down, but Eric Brown does not claim it was Doolittle himself that told him that. I think it's likely that the way this got started was that someone higher up in British aviation was talking with Doolittle at some point, that surely happened all the time, and the subject of Mach limits came up. Doolittle in conversation probably said that there was still research to be done in this area, and sort of like children playing a game of telephone, this was eventually changed to the Americans need urgent help figuring this out, and of course we, the British, are the ones that need to do it. That's just my speculation, of course, but it makes more sense to me than the idea that Eric Brown just made the whole thing up. It's also true that testing Mach limits in World War II fighters was very dangerous work. It makes sense to me that to justify the risks involved, the test pilots, including Eric Brown, were probably told it's urgent or critical for the war effort, or whatever phrasing was used to explain the need for this high-risk flight testing. Then later, when Eric Brown saw the 8th Air Force was rapidly bringing in P-51s, replacing P-38s and P-47s, in his mind, he probably really thought it had something to do with the testing he did. However, it had nothing to do with it. There is no U.S. Army Air Force document that even considers swapping in the P-51s because of poor Thunderbolt dive performance. It was done for other reasons which are well documented. As for the P-38 Lightning, it certainly did have a low Mach limit, no question about that. But that's not something Eric Brown discovered. It had been known for at least 3 years at that point, and was in the pilot manuals going back to at least 1942, probably back farther, but the oldest 38 manual I have is from 1942. In fact, at that point, Lockheed probably had done more research on Mach limits than anyone else, as the P-38 was the first fighter to go fast enough at high enough altitudes to encounter this problem with relative ease. Eric Brown saying that he and the team he was working with were the first ones that figured this out is just ridiculous. In fact, it appears to me that he only dove the P-38 to about the maximum speed allowed by the pilot's manual and reported that Mach number as estimated by the airspeed indication. That's reasonable, but then for people to argue that Eric Brown made some great discovery here is not reasonable. Eric Brown is certainly an important figure in World War II aviation history. He was in the Royal Navy, he flew Grumman Martlets, essentially a Wildcat, and in that plane he shot down 2 German maritime patrol aircraft. He survived his aircraft carrier sinking at sea, which is a harrowing experience. He was an ideal candidate to be a test pilot for the British because he knew quite a bit about German aviation. His first flight ever was in a Bucher Jungmann, flown by none other than Ernst Udet. He studied in Germany, spoke fluent German. He was literally in Germany when the war started. The Germans actually arrested him, but then let him go home via Switzerland. His familiarity with the German language and German aviation, combined with the fact that he was a Royal Navy pilot, made him an ideal candidate for test flying captured German aircraft. Now, the big accolade that people often mention is that Eric Brown flew more types of aircraft than anyone else in history, and I think he did. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, 487 different types. This is an impressive number. I don't doubt for a second that it's true, but context matters here. During World War II, everyone was constantly coming out with new versions of existing types, and that record counts all these different versions of these types. For example, there are at least 14 different versions of Spitfires and Seafires in there. Some of these are quite different from each other, but some are almost the same. The list even counts the Piper Cub and the Piper Grasshopper as two different aircraft. Those two planes are the same thing. He certainly flew a lot of different planes, probably more than anyone else ever will. But that alone does not make him an expert on any one type, and certainly not more of an expert on any single type than those who actually flew it a lot or flew it in combat. I think this is where a sort of weird disconnect happens. People use that number of types he flew as some sort of huge accolade, and then based on that, say he was the greatest test pilot ever, or even the greatest pilot who ever lived. From there, they consider everything he says as infallible. However, he is not infallible. And as for the idea that the P-38 and P-47 Thunderbolt were useless because of poor dive performance, he was dead wrong. That's all for now. Goodbye and have a great day.